planet. Despite the theories and speculations, the answer remains an unsolved mystery. As to where he is, that's easier. A planet 8,000 miles in diameter, located in a remote portion of a galaxy, somewhere in infinite space. Why is he here? That too remains an unsolved mystery. Occupied by his daily affairs, he finds little time to contemplate such questions, except for those moments on a clear night when man pauses and looks to the star-filled heavens, and in his mind stirs an unanswered question. He searches his thoughts for an explanation, a key to the faint, forgotten memory of his past.
The program for this evening is not new. You've seen this entertainment through and through. You've seen your birth, your life and death. You might recall all of the rest. Did you have a good world when you died? Enough to base a movie on?
Wow, so this is cold storage.
It is, it's cold.
In a highly secure, climate-controlled vault in Los Angeles, Ann Morrison tuning is a guardian of some significant rock and roll history. The Jim Morrison Archive.
It is, that's what we got.
Her brother, Jim Morrison, lead singer of The Doors, died 50 years ago. He was just 27. But he left behind boxes filled with journals, poems,
Riders on the storm,
and handwritten lyrics of what would become hit songs. Looks like an album cover almost.
I know,
photo,
it
doesn't
could be.
There's Morrison's passport and family photos.
Here's Jim and his cousin
At a door.
at a door.
How old was he when he drew that?
He was probably 18.
And a drawing he made of his younger sister.
Jim self-published his own books.
Tuning has now put much of what she found in the vault into a nearly 600-page book, The Collected Works of Jim Morrison. As well as lyrics and journals, the book includes poetry by Morrison never before published. Growing up, he seemed destined to be a poet, which Tuning didn't think was a good idea.
No, who thinks their brother can make it as a poet, you know?
Morrison suddenly became famous in 1967 with The Doors' first hit, Light My Fire. It happened so fast, Tuning didn't even realize who she was hearing on the radio. Morrison had just graduated from film school at UCLA when another graduate, keyboard player Ray Manzarek, invited him to form a band. From the late 60s to the early 70s, The Doors released hit
hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name?
after hit.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe.
They sold more than 100 million records worldwide. And do you think Jim would have been happier in some ways being James Douglas Morrison, poet, rather than Jim Morrison, rock star?
Well, sometimes he spoke of it himself a couple of ways, and he said maybe he wouldn't mind have been just a poet in a garden, you know, in a little house. But then he also said, the past few years, I'd never have met so many people and done so many things without being in the band, so.
Delightful. And the third one in the trio, Jim Morrison. Jim
Jim.
also bottle. What was Jim like?
Jim was a cool guy. He was, he had a great sense of humor, and we used to drink a lot. He would always come in and immediately jump on top of my bed and stand up and read his new poems to me, and ask me what I thought. We would drink, and the funniest time, we were in Europe and we were touring, and they would go on one night first, and then we would go on the next night first. We traded back and forth like this. And, we were partying, and one time we were in Sweden, and Jim and I were out, and we were pretty wasted. We went back to the hotel, and he said, I'll meet you in the pool, So I went up to the pool, and I see Jim, and hey, and I'm pretty stoned out of my mind, already. And I dive in the low end of the pool, right? 2 feet. So I come up, and Jim's going. And I feel blood just streaming down my face, and I go, oh, great, So I go on that night, and we go on first this night. So here I am, all scarred up, And Mr. Beautiful was sitting over there, watching me like this, seeing what I'm going to do. So I go on and we open with Plastic Fantastic, in fact. And it was just great. I'm right on it. I got the crowd. Everybody's going nuts, And I see Morrison over the corner of my eye, and somebody gives him a big ball of hash, And I see him go. He's eating it down. So I'm singing. I got the crowd going, and suddenly Jim comes dancing out around me. He's dancing around. He's dancing around. So I'm singing to Jim, and he's dancing around with me, and we're wrapping ourselves up in the chord, And then we unwrap just at the end of the song, and the crowd's going crazy, Jim looks at me and goes, "Beat that motherfucker." I falls out right at my feet. I never got up for the show that night. But it was so cool. He looked at me with that look in his face and said, "Beat that motherfucker."
The thing that really strikes you with Jim Morrison as a frontman and as a singer and an all-round artist is that he is so clear in his artistic direction. He is not writing this music because the record label is telling him to do it. He is in total control of the direction that he wants to go in musically and the way that he wants to write lyrically. There's nothing holding him back. And that is a great thing to see from an artist. And nowadays it's so rare to have artists that have that expression, that freedom of expression with their music without a larger entity such as a record label telling them how they should sound and what they want the next album to sound like. Mentioning the poetry and how deeply Jim was into literature, reading, writing, and going back to his school days, his English teacher said that when Jim would approach him to discuss these books that he'd been reading, the teacher thought that Jim was making up these books because the teacher had never heard of them, whereas when the teacher looked into it, he realized these were real books, and the paper that Jim had written could only have been sourced from the Library of Congress because it was on books that included 16th and 17th century demonology. So from an early age, Jim had an interest in literature that certainly wasn't the norm.
When Hendrix and Joplin and Jim Morrison and Brian Epstein died, all of a sudden you begin to realize that part of your life, those people aren't there anymore, and you begin to miss them.
Probably the forerunner to the whole punk scene was Jim Morrison of The Doors. He's so popular now, even after his death. You knew him in the early days.
He was a very complex young man, but at the same time very gentle, and one who would listen and want to learn, but he had it. He really sort of mesmerized an audience.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination.
He was a revolutionary too, and he and the Doors changed music and changed the way a lot of people look at things and became an icon along with Elvis.
And Jim Morrison was also a poet.
He considered himself a poet. He considered himself a filmmaker. He had a sense of humor about himself. He was extraordinarily intelligent. He could talk about anything. He'd read everything and remembered it all and put it together in interesting ways.
Jim actually had a small circle of close friends, not a large entourage of hangers-on like so many celebrities seem to have. Would you agree with that?
Usually he hung with the people he was doing work with. So when we were making Highway, the film Highway, or the film Feast of Friends, it was the 3 or 4 of us who were working on the film together.
In the book, Sherry mentions that Pamela did have an entourage. Is that true?
I didn't know Pamela well enough because she didn't want to be known well by Jim's other friends. She wanted an exclusive hold on Jim, it seemed to me, and she deserved it. She's a very quiet and self-possessed person. So I have nothing really to say about her. She seemed to be supportive of the part of Jim that he needed support for, and that was his poetry, and I respect her for that. It's a really romantic story. 2 young kids meeting on the Sunset Strip. They lived in the Love generation, and they lived on Love Street. And
In reading your new book, I got a much different view of who Jim Morrison was as a person. I'm now questioning what I should believe about Jim.
What I tell people about Jim Morrison is if you want to know the guy, really know the guy, read his poetry, read what he wrote. I mean, he left us hundreds of pages of writings, and much of it is autobiographical.
You first met Jim when you were both film students at UCLA, so when you knew Jim before the Doors were even formed and you were close friends up until the day he died, did you see any real differences in who Jim was before the fame and after the fame?
The major difference that I can talk about was his self-confidence. There were a lot of people who had a lot more personality being expressed during those UCLA days, and Jim wasn't that way. I mean, one hardly heard from him in class. Later, after he had been on stage for a while and developed a great singing voice and become who he was, there was a self-confidence in meeting with the press, in being on stage, in virtually all aspects, meeting with fans on the street. But he still retained among us, when he was just with us, that humility, that quietness, that shyness. I guess that's the word I look for. He was shy at UCLA. He was shy and quiet, and he still retained a lot of that later on. But then there was this new self-confidence.
Jim was into the concept of Dionysian ecstasy, and Dionysus was a Greek god who was the opposite of Apollo. Apollo is the god of order, of music, of propriety, of the right stuff. You know, all our missiles, all our rockets that go to the moon are all called Apollo. America is a very Apollonian country. And the Dionysian ecstasy was not a mental order, it was a physical order. You would get into the physical and just kind of revel in drunkenness, revel in excitement, revel in just being alive, just the spirit of your own body. We want the world and we want
it. When I first heard about the Doors, I was in another group, and my friend John Dinsmore, who I'd known in school earlier, was telling me about this group that he was in called the Doors. They had this wild, crazy guy, Jim Morrison, who was going to be the lead singer, even though he couldn't sing at the time. But I knew he had the potential because you know, he had just started singing maybe a month ago, and then he was already pretty good, even though he'd never really sang before. If Jim was on that night, it could be the greatest thing you ever saw. It was like a religious experience, because you might, you know, the audience was already in some kind of an altered state, hopefully, when they got there. And then Jim was like the shaman who would take them over the edge and lead them into another realm, you know.
An ancient lunatic reigns in the trees of the night.
You have to give yourself up to it and kind of sink down into it. You know, there's a conscious level at which you operate, and then there's a higher consciousness at which you're sort of in the stars and in the cosmos and everything. And then there's a lower level of consciousness, a kind of primal level, primeval level that Jim used to like to talk about. And I think that's what the Doors got into. We would leave the conscious mind and sink down into the unconscious and kind of just mill around in there and work around and twist ourselves around and let the snakes run around in our brains and feel that rhythm and that power that comes from all this part of the body, the lower part of the body.
Didn't expose himself, and it was a real crazy concert where a policeman came up and took, Jim was wearing a hat, a skull and crossbone. This policeman came up and took it off, threw it in the audience. And Jim took the cop's hat off and threw that in the audience. And at the end of the gig, our manager paid the cop for his hat, and we were all laughing about it. And then we left. And 4 days later, warrants are issued. So it was political.
Miami was the first gig on the 20-city tour, and after the incident happened and the press got a hold of it and all the trouble and the fact that Jim was in fact arrested, every city canceled out. We lost the entire tour.
Jim would do all kinds of weird things on stage, but as far as I could tell, he never whipped it out, nor did he ever simulate oral copulation on the guitar player, which was me.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. And shadow.
You are now traveling through a dimension of imagination.
As I say in my play, in the video, I say it was a real love-hate relationship. I loved him for his art and his words, and I hated him for his self-destruction. The early years, we were all buddies. He was like a college guy, and we were like fraternity brothers. As he started to destroy himself, I pulled away from him as a statement, you know, and he knew it. He knew I disapproved of how far he was going. But he was set on it, you know. There's nothing I could do about it. Like, I don't know, man. I get a kick out of the negative reviews.
Ensenada, the dog crucifix, the dead seal, ghost of the dead car's son. Stop the car! I'm getting out! I can't take it. Hey, look out, there's somebody coming, and there's nothing you can do about it.
The road to excess leads to the palace of wisdom. And Jim Morrison was a very excessive person. I think he had to be excessive. He had to take it to extremes. But by being excessive, he lived out on the edge for all of us. All of us that are, let's face it, afraid to go out there. He was out there all by himself. And he was bringing messages back to us who were afraid to go out there. And it was excessive, you know? He lived an excessive life, but he did it for all of us. I think that kind of talent has to be excessive. That kind of genius has to go out there where we are afraid to go.
You walked on down the hallway, baby. He looked inside.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas.
It's like I feel that I've been through a lot. Great highs and some real heavy lows. And I wouldn't change it.
I think these days, especially in the States, you have to be a politician or an assassin or something to really be a superstar.
For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. But If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. The Doors.
But love a few times, girl, flies me out to the week. Love a few times, I'm gone away. Maybe.
And as most of you have seen. But the reason I went and bought this one was the Genesis one has autographs. At least that's what they say. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, wow. Two of the Doors and Ann and I think Jim's brother, Andy, whatever it is, and some other stuff. But what I really dug about this kit, well, it's the box now, but it actually, in these you get, one of the books, they've been copied per page. His little writings, stuff he crossed out, whatever. I haven't looked at it yet, obviously. Collect Your Time. We Have to Climb. So a bunch of cool information for me. And then another one, little pad with this, he wrote Lizard Celebration on the front. And there's little drawings that he made. Oh, this is so fucking cool. Lions in the street and roaming, dogs in heat, rapid foaming, a beast caged in the heart of the city. The whole thing written out in his hand. Oh my God. This is pretty cool. Love you guys.
America, man, you know, it's so beautiful. I want to eat it.